There was a man in the 20th century called Waldo Demarest, who some of you might know from the film The Great Imposter. He is thought to have been the most successful at being an imposter ever. He made himself take on the guise of various roles, civil engineer, teacher, and at the height of his success, he even became a naval surgeon on a Canadian naval boat during the Korean War and performed several surgeries on the ship despite having had no training. The only way it was discovered was somebody dug a little more into his background, and they found out that he was an imposter. And we love those stories because we think not only is it incredible the work they've put into their craft, but I think most of us then see ourselves as being someone who that wouldn't work on, that we wouldn't ever possibly fall for the imposter story. And the truth is that any of us can, because some people put really good work into that. And it's a really interesting area of human behavior, the degree to which someone can pretend to be something else in order to, whether it's for their ego or just to get something temporarily that they need. And that's what happens in this story in Joshua chapter 9. There's an amazing breakdown of a group of imposters and what they're able to get out of the situation. And I think in chapter 9, the way that story unfolds is a bit more relevant to us than perhaps what happens in chapter 10, where the sun stands still. And we've already seen things like this in the journey of the children of Israel, such as when God twice parted the waters to get them to where they are geographically today. So by this point in the story, we are used to God intervening in nature and creation and performing miracles. What I think is a bit more mysterious, if you like, is what happens with the Gibeonites as imposters, and particularly the fact that it's in some ways the mistakes and the imperfections of Joshua and the other leaders that ends up creating this situation. Where we were last week was that the Israelites have course corrected, and they've gotten rid of the sin in their midst, and they've carried on in the conquest of the promised land. And the problem is now people know that they can be defeated. And so after the rout that they had at the city of Ai, they have a number of the other city-states thinking they could probably be taken down. And the best way to think of Canaan and the Promised Land, rather than a nation as we think of it today, it's a collection of individual city-states, much like we had in Scotland hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It was much more provincial, and people had their own territories that they ruled, and that's the way Canaan is. But some of these kings, as Margaret read for us, of these city-states are now starting to come together, and they're starting to coalesce in order to try and defeat Israel and put a stop to them. So that's where we find ourselves, and that's the background to the Gibeonites having decided, well, we're going to do something different. And why do they do that? Well, almost certainly everyone in the area, and Gibeon's about it's really only about 30 kilometers from where Israel are camped in Gilgal. So they would have been connected geographically and probably politically to all the other city-states. But it seems from this that a pretty strong pact was made that we're going to go and we're going to have the Israelites, we're going to take them on. The Gibeonites probably weren't in a position really to say much else to try and sue for peace. And so they go for this strategy, which is the imposter, the deception. And it works. And this is how it works, because imperfect decisions are made by imperfect leaders within Israel, and then somehow they end up with this total and perfect salvation, which is another just glimmer of hope and light within otherwise what's quite a dreary story in the conquest of the Promised Land. So that's what I'm going to focus on this morning. I'm going to look at the imperfect decisions that were made, then we're going to look at the imperfect leaders that made them, and then we're going to look at the perfect salvation that comes out through that, and apply these things as we go along, because I hope you'll see that these things do continue to speak to us and have relevance for us today. So what do the Gibeonites do? Well, they come up And they say, your servants have come from a very distant country. Not true. Because of they came from up the road. Because of the fame of the Lord your God, we've heard reports of him, what he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan. And so our elders and all those living in our country said to us, take provisions for your journey and go and meet them. And then they bring out their provision. They put a lot of work practically into this. This bread was warm when we packed it on the day we left, but now see how dry and moldy it is. And these wineskins that we filled were new, but see how cracked they are. And our clothes and sandals are worn out by the long journey. So they take it seriously. They get deliberately aged and worn and moldy items, and they bring it to show it as proof. So they take their role seriously. And then this is where the decision is made. The Israelites decided to test it. They sampled their provisions, but, verse 14, did you catch this in the reading? Did not inquire of the Lord. And that seems to be where things go a bit wrong. And so then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them and let them live. And the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. Now, this was such a good strategy by the Gibeonites. It says actually at the beginning that they've resorted to a ruse. Now the word there for ruse, it's used in the Old Testament in Proverbs, and it can mean incredible cunning or skill, or it can also mean treachery. And it's quite ambiguous, and it's deliberately ambiguous, because depending on which day you read this and how you look at it, it either is highly deceptive and immoral, or it is actually just quite brilliant and to be admired. And that's how you feel about people like Waldo Demera. You think, well, that's not right, pretending to be a surgeon. But part of you admires it and goes, well, you know, he had a lot of gumption and he had obviously a lot of courage, and my goodness, imagine doing that. So it's a ruse, though. Ultimately, it is deceptive. And they do this to try and ensure their own survival and to get what they need. And look at specifically even their language. We heard what, because of the fame of the Lord your God and all that he did in Egypt. So they're doing what sometimes Christians do. They're speaking the language of Zion. They know exactly the words that the Israelites are going to want to hear to try and make it more believable that they really are believing in this God. And maybe they have, and maybe they do. And all of that is left open to us. And just as an aside, that happens all the time, and that continues to happen. As we journey through life and in the Christian faith and in the church, lots of people have lots of different motivations for coming to church. And people sometimes will come and they'll speak the language of Zion and sound very theological and erudite, but they haven't really had Jesus do much or transform their heart. They're just really good at saying it and speaking it. And if you're in church long enough, you'll meet those kinds of characters. And then there's other people that have had a dramatic experience, but it's not that long ago, and they're filled with the language and the joy, and they just want to be identified with the church. And the key is in the fact that you and I do not have X-ray vision into anybody's heart to be able to tell the difference between those things. And when we sit and try and make ourselves judges of it, it usually is wrong, because we just can't see anyone's heart the way God can. But they decide to do this ruse to ensure their own survival. And then Joshua doesn't inquire of the Lord, and he makes a treaty of peace, which is technically not what they were meant to do. They were not meant to try and kind of make friends with the people of the land and sue for peace. They were meant to clear them away as part of the idolatry of the place. And it's because he didn't inquire of the Lord. And previously in the story, we've heard that when they did inquire of the Lord, it generally tended to go well. So there's a theme developing here. But then I thought it would be interesting to think of, well, if this is an imperfect decision because he doesn't inquire of the Lord, how was he meant to inquire of the Lord? And how are you and I meant to inquire of the Lord? How can we do that and know that we're not being deceived and not being taken for a ruse? What are we meant to do? Well, in the Old Testament, there's no one answer to that. Sometimes it seems to be in prayer. Sometimes God seems to speak dramatically, audibly, and directly to the people. So that would be nice if God always did that. That would make things very clear for us, but that's probably not most of our experience. There was another practice around the tabernacle where there was there was like sacred stones called the Urim and the Thummim, and if you've ever read Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, you'll know about these. And they would sometimes, it was a bit like an oracle, they would light up or go tell the Israelite kings, particularly David, whether they should go to battle or not. Now, I don't have one of them, and you probably don't. That probably seems more like witchcraft to us than anything, but that's the way it worked. So what do we have now? Because we need to make this relevant. What does it mean to inquire of the Lord? Well, something consistent with the Old and the New Testament that's capitalized on is obviously prayer, is inquiring of the Lord via prayer. And 1 Thessalonians 5, the apostle tells us to pray without ceasing. Now, some people interpret that in different ways and look to make it obsessive and think that they have to pray about which pair of socks to put on in the morning. And I've met these people. That exists, you know. It means for it to be a habitual practice, that there's just something rhythmic and regular about us asking and bringing things to God. And that is not only a devotional practice, an act of worship, but it's also been shown actually psychologically to be of benefit to us, that we're offloading, that we're externalizing the thing and saying, I'm bringing this to you, God. But also, as I was saying to the kids, something that runs from the Old to the New Testament is the idea that God speaks to people in their hearts. And that's not just a Pentecostal or super charismatic thing, because we have, in 1 Kings 3, we have Solomon asking God to give him a discerning and an understanding heart. And then in Hebrews in the New Testament, we're told that God can make us discerning and give us the ability to tell between good and evil, to tell between being able to go to the right hand or the left. So for you and I to inquire of the Lord and to help us in making decisions, and not that we'll do it perfectly, and not that we'll always get it right, but I hope that you find this practical through the growth in prayer, but also in trusting that God is renewing our heart. He will give you an increased awareness and sense of what is right, of what is going to lead to your flourishing and the flourishing of those around you. And I think this is what some people call, if you like, a sixth sense or a gut feeling. Gut, as we now know from science, is your second brain. There's a lot of neurotransmitters in your gut. And so the ancient people, when they thought of something and being in the pit of their stomach in terms of a psychological feeling, they weren't wrong. God has made us fearfully and wonderfully, as the psalmist tells us. And so those prompts are sometimes just not to be ignored. They sometimes have a lot to say to us. And perhaps it's for you and I to be open to the possibility. And right now you may even be able to think of examples and times in your life where you got that prompt and it either said, not sure this is a great idea. You ignored it, and lo and behold, it was not a great idea. I know I've been there so many times that I should have really learned it by now, but I haven't, and it takes time, and God is patient with us. But also, that prompt can sometimes say something, this is a good idea, despite the evidence. This might not seem like the most sane or the most rational thing to do, but there's something to it. That was part of my call to ministry. It didn't seem very sane or rational to leave a career that I was doing really well in and that I was really enjoying and I thought I would be in for the rest of my life to come and do this, but here I am. You might still think that was insane, but nevertheless, here we are. God will keep working with you, and by you continuing to push those thoughts up and out and externalize them in prayer, that's inquiring of the Lord, but he will continue to develop your heart and your soul to lean into what is going to lead to pleasing him, but also to the flourishing of you. Because it's not just about, so often, what is God's will? What should I do? In Christianity is as if God has this divine blueprint and only one way can be followed for every decision, and you've got to try and get on that track and stay on it, and it's just right for its own sake. And that's not it. God's design is for his kingdom to be on earth as it is in heaven. That means that people are fulfilled and flourishing, and the world is becoming more peaceful and reflecting his goodness and love. And so that sense should be there to push and help us towards that. Okay, it's not just getting God's will for the sake of God's will. It's getting God's will so that our lives and the world around us reflect the goodness, character, nature, and love of him. And we'll get it wrong. We'll make imperfect decisions, just as Joshua did. And Joshua's obviously an imperfect leader, and that starts to come out from verse 19 onwards. Verse 16 onwards. 3 days after this peace treaty was made, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors. So it got out that, hang on, these guys are just from up the road. They are not far travelers. They have taken our leaders for a ride. And then the whole assembly, what do? They grumbled against the leaders. And the leaders answered, "There's nothing we can do. We've given them an oath by the Lord, the God of Israel, and we cannot touch them now." So, here's what happens. The people hear about it, and they go to the leaders and they say, you have completely messed this up. You have been taken in, you've been blindsided, and the implication of the text is you should just wipe these guys out because they've lied to you. It's time to sort them out. And the leaders end up going, that might be true, but our hands are tied because of the decision we made and we got into. There's nothing we can do. We don't want to break our oath to God to preserve and protect their lives. Now, it turns out that Joshua, even though being God's choice and anointed successor to Moses, and the people and the elders around him, turns out that he was capable of, at least in the eyes of the people, making a mistake. How can we relate to that today? Have you ever encountered a leader who can make a mistake? They're out there, I promise you. They're everywhere. Because he has to make a decision in leadership. And he has to make it fairly quickly, because at the end of the day, they're in a war and in a battle situation. And he also has a lot of work having gone into manipulating him towards that decision. So it turns out he was someone who was able to be manipulated as well. And it's that imperfection of the leaders and of the heroes of the biblical story that's such a unique characteristic of the Bible. It continually represents this for us so that we're able to see that this is just such a human book and a human story that God somehow works through and in and intervenes in. And this is, I'm so glad it's in here because it's so consistent, because as somebody in church leadership today, and I'm sure any of the elders in the church would say the same thing, is that we know that we're imperfect and we know that we handle situations imperfectly. But imperfect doesn't mean a total write-off, because as we're going to see, this leads to the salvation of a people and the mission of the people of God in this situation continuing. Now, in terms of leaders, don't get me wrong, I think the church has taken so many wrong turns, the church in the broadest possible sense, and you get very bad and very toxic leaders, and they create climates of fear and manipulation, and they use the platform as a platform for their own ego rather than for the word of God, and all of that happens. So this is not to say that leadership should never be challenged, because I'm not going to make the point that they grumbled and that wasn't the right thing to do, so you should never challenge leadership. That would be absolutely toxic. It's not the point. The whole reason we have a Presbyterian system of government is so that we don't have just one person who's like a bishop who rules over a bunch of other. It's that there's a plurality of leaders, because we realize actually the church, even on its best day, is led by sinners and people who are like this, who make imperfect decisions and have imperfect styles and approaches to leadership. But despite that, the mission of God continues. And so, as someone who identifies with this, and I think as a church that can identify with this, the application, I think, is to try and move forward together, because we're in an uncharted territory, as I'm fond of saying to you. The church that you're sitting in today, even if you've been in Erskine since the start, looks and feels very different because of everything that's going on in our society and the way demographics and aging population and all of that. So the church feels different and is going to continue to feel different. And the church is nationally is even very different to when I was younger, when I was in my teens. It's different since the pandemic. And so for those of us in leadership, we ask that you remember us in prayer, because we're in uncharted waters. We're in a situation where we don't always know where to go next, and we're trying to make the best of it with new information and new challenges coming all the time, and more limited resources. And all of that in leaders creates incredible pressure. And that doesn't mean that if they're absolutely toxic and awful leaders that they shouldn't be called to account and challenged. Yes, they should. But I think the word grumbling is always negative in the Old Testament. And it's meant to offer the alternative of either go to the leader, as Jesus says in the New Testament, or pray and ask God to work in the situation or to help and to aid them carry the weight of leadership and responsibility that they do. Because the easiest thing in the world is to have a go. And because we all think we could do better, particularly if you're a football fan. Everyone thinks they can do a better job than the manager. You might have seen on the news yesterday, after the St Mirren game, one of the fans did that. They absolutely had a go at Stephen Robinson, the manager. And he decided yesterday that he was not having it. And he went up, and it wasn't a great picture for anyone involved, but the two of them are squaring up. But you can see the colour drain from the guy's face when the manager turns and starts chatting back to him. Because he didn't expect that. He expected the abuse to go one way and not to have to deal with it. And Stephen Robertson, having lost narrowly in a game, had obviously had enough, because he probably gets that kind of thing from the terraces a lot, and far more than he should. As any manager knows, everyone thinks from the stands that they could do a better job and they like to have a go. But it's not actually easy being in that seat. So pray for leaders wherever you find them. That's why I try and emulate praying for national and political leaders. And I'll never say what political persuasion any of you should be from the pulpit, because it's not my job. I'm here to serve you, whether you're any political stripe. But I'll pray for any leader who's in office, because I recognize that job is difficult. Whether I completely disagree them on nearly everything, I'll still pray for them, because that's what they need, more so than publicly my grumbling, because they bear enormous responsibility on their shoulders. So you have imperfect leaders everywhere making imperfect decisions. And finally, what does God do with that at the end of the chapter? Well, they end up having a role in God's purposes. They become the water carriers, for want of a better purpose. But there's also hints that they begin to flourish in the text, which I just don't have time to go into. But they again repeat their confession. Your servants were clearly told how the Lord God had commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and wipe the inhabitants from before you. So we feared for our lives because of you, and that's why we did this. We are now in your hands. Do to us whatever seems good and right to you. So that we're now starting to come round to the confession of faith seems genuine. And it should remind you of another story like this, where an outsider recognized the power and the grace of the God of Israel and wanted to be included as part of it. Remember the story of Rahab? She heard what had happened. She confessed the faith to the Israelites, and she was saved. And what's the outcome? So Joshua, verse 26, saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. Now, I love that verse 26, because it's amazing, because there's so much, as I said in Joshua, that is exactly what we'd expect from an ancient document that deals with ancient warfare. But there's little bits like that jump out and surprise you. So Joshua saved them. Joshua in the Hebrew means God saves. He lives up to his name, but not for his own people. You see, the Israelites wanted to get towed into the Gibeonites. They wanted to get stuck in and to show them a lesson for having pulled off that ruse. And Joshua stands as a barrier between them. And he says, I've made a treaty. I'm going to keep my word. And actually, he leans into the fact that it's God's will that these people be saved. They are outsiders. They are people that elsewhere in the text, God has said, nope, sorry, you've got to get rid of all of them. But here you have a treaty of God and Joshua working as God's agent to stand in the gap and to save them. Now, I know that's complicated and complex and a lot to hold in, but I think we've always got to go with where the scripture looks like it's pointing towards the gospel and towards the work of Jesus. Because Jesus comes, and who does he come to save? His friends, the people who like him, the people who are like him. He comes for his enemies. He dies for his enemies. While we were yet strangers and aliens, while we were enemies of God, Christ Jesus died for us. Because that's ultimately the experience of every Christian, and that's what salvation really consists of, is somebody who ultimately doesn't have any purchase or buy-in and nothing to come and impress God with, and then they have the overwhelming realization that Christ has died for them, that he has stood between them and separation from God, and he has brought them in to be near to God. He has, as the Gibeonites were, brought you and I in to the purposes and the promises of the people of God and made us part of that covenant community and family. And so Joshua lives up to his name, and he saves his people who were outsiders, who should have been destined to be outsiders and to be wiped out, but they're brought in and they're saved. And you and I, that's happened for us. And so I hate making these comparisons to Old Testament heroes, but we should be like Joshua in that we bear the name of God, as in God saves. And we have the posture of, you know what, God could save anyone, and God can bring anyone into his covenant community. And it doesn't matter where they come from out there and what they look like or what their life looks like or how different they are from us, that God can and will save. We should expect God to do that and to look for him to do that, because that's what Joshua's name is ultimately all about, and particularly for the outsider and those that are beyond the walls of this community. And all that salvation came through very imperfect people and leaders making imperfect decisions. And yet through all of that, in Joshua and also in the church, God continues to save. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.